Hmm.
Okay, I
Go
think
ahead.
we are live now. Yes, yes. Welcome everyone. Welcome to the second installment of this online lecture series that we have organized. It is based on an undergraduate text that we are reading, Chronicle of a Death Foretold by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. We have with us Dr. Anirban Bhattacharjee, who delivered a splendid lecture last week, and we are fortunate enough to have him again this evening. So he is head of the department, Shantipur College, Noida. He has been published widely in several national, international journals. He has been working relentlessly on critical theory, post-colonial theory, Mahabharat studies, and so on. He has been a dear friend and colleague to all of us. So we welcome Dr. Bhattacharjee. All of us, all of the viewers who are watching us on YouTube today are requested to leave their questions. We will have a 45 minute lecture session, and then we will go towards the end of the lecture. We will try to address the questions that come in the comments. So I won't waste any further time. Over to Dr. Anirban Bhattacharjee for today's lecture, Chronicle of a Death Foretold, Rethinking Narrativity. Thank you.
Thank you, Partha. Thank you for the introduction. Uh, uh, this lecture is basically meant for the undergraduate students. So, as I had just talked with Shamradda and you all, so I would first like to give a charted glimpse of the narrative, what happened in the narrative. I am going to give a critical summary of the narrative. Then I will move on to the concept, move on to the theme of the lecture, that is rethinking narrativity. So the first chapter of the Chronicle of a Death Foretold opens with a sentence that announces that on a particular day, the main character Santiago Nazar is going to be killed. This is very important, and in the opening sentence there is the particular time uh, and the particular date is there. And while this event is the focus of the narrative, there is at least one subplot, that is the wedding of Angela Vicari and Beardo San Roman. And there is also a secondary event that distracts the characters in the novel while the killers go about their business, the visit of a bishop, that is going in parallel with the main plot. At the last minute, the bishop decides not to get off the boat in which he is traveling. The omniscient narrator, but this narrator is very much in confusion, in doubt, and in a contradictory pool, always in a contradictory pool, and he is functioning like a murder detective and reconstructs the crime bit by bit. In the process, it describes a classic coastal town where religion and law as institutions are inefficient in protecting the town's folk. Santiago Nazar and his friends are all members of the ruling class. The narrator's family, for instance, is the best friends of the Nazar family, and so also reasonable expectations that the bishop will pay them a personal visit during his stay in town. And we have a description of the town's economic makeup that presents a background of contrasting wealth and poverty. Nazar, the only child, lives in one of the best houses in the town and uh, has his maids, mulatto maids, and is owner of a farmhouse. Uh, and its name is very interesting, Divine Face. His date gives the novel its title, The Chronicle of a Date Foretold. With few exceptions, nearly everybody in the town, the mayor and the priest included, know that the identical twins, Pedro and Pablo Vicario, are looking for Santiago Nazar in order to kill him. That is absolutely clear in the narrative. What makes the plot intriguing are the pieces of information that are left for the reader to put together. So while I'll be discussing on narrativity, I'll be talking about how the reader is collecting this information to construct the narrative in their own accord. That is very interesting. Uh, Santiago Nazar, however, is not aware that he is the target of Vicario brothers until right before the time he is attacked. However, the traits that weave together the murder are all present in the first chapter of the narrative. Uh, and at the end of the first chapter, uh, we find, or we are told, that Santiago Nazar was killed, and how he was killed and why. These facts, however, are the guideposts that allow Garcia Marquez an opportunity to take readers to an intricate and detailed labyrinth of surprises. That is the beauty and brilliance of the narrative. The second and the subsequent chapters flesh out the plot, so to speak. Beardo San Roman is the man who marries Angela Vicario only to return her to her parents 5 hours after the wedding ceremony. Angela is not a virgin, which has a significant and potentially dangerous consequences, of which Angela is amply aware. She knows that there is no love between her and Beardo, and she wants to stop the marriage. The Vicarios, however, are impressed by Beardo's wealth and oppose Angela's decision. And the comedy of errors, which turns into a tragedy, builds up bit by bit and minute by minute. Angela doesn't love Beardo, and neither does he love her. Rather, he is enamored with the concept of being married to a beautiful woman. The wedding celebration is an excuse for Beardo San Roma to show off his wealth and power. And the narrator interestingly comments that Beardo could marry any woman he chose. He is the son of a decorated hero who had defeated Colonel Aureliano Buendia, who is there in the 100 Years of Solitude, important character, the Buendia family in Macondo. And if the lack of love is not a good enough reason to stop Beardo and Angela Vicario from getting married, Angela's loss of her virginity to someone other than Beardo is enough to cause her return. Beardo does not beat Angela for her indiscretion, but her mother does for ours. That is there in the narrative. Questioned and pressured to name the perpetrator, Angela names Santiago Nazar. Pedro and Pablo, the twin brothers of Angela, know what to do next. In fact, the whole community knows that to restore the Vicario's honor, which resides in Angela's virginity, Santiago must be killed. However, the reader did not witness this event until the last chapter. Before that, the plot reconstructs the psychological reaction of the twins who believes they are innocent before God and before men. After 3 years in jail awaiting trial, the twins are acquitted by the court because of their action is considered legitimate defense of their family's honor. That is very interesting. That is the very most significant and important moment in the narrative. Before the murder, the twins tell everybody of their intent, but people do not believe them. When the town's mayor is told, he treats them like children, confiscates the butcher knives, and sends them home to sleep. They come back with a second set of knives and look for Santiago in places where they know he will not be. They are hoping not to find them. They plan to kill them, yet hope someone will stop them. However, no one takes responsibility to see that the killing does not occur. In fact, there are those like Santiago Nazar or Santiago's maid, Victoria Guzman, who wanted Santiago dead. She does not tell Santiago, although she is aware of it, that the Vicario brothers are looking for him. And reader comes to an end of the third chapter and reads, they have killed Santiago Nazar. However, the plot has not yet entirely unfolded. The reader still not a first-hand witness, or he or she continues to be led, and the narrator still holds the reader in suspense. Almost tormentingly, the narrator's voice, narrative voice continues leisurely to piece the story, the narrative together. Indeed, no stone is left unturned ultimately. The narrator recounts the story, the narrative of the life of both Angela Vicario and Beardo San Roman. And finally, we see that 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 they have reconciled understanding about love. It seems like another error in a comedy that is meant to be a tragedy. And does not love Beardo. He takes her back for not being a virgin. Her brothers kill Santiago Nazar to regain the honor and that of her family. And finally, she realizes 17 years later that she really loves him. That is the very intricate moment of the narrative. And finally in the last chapter, the reader witnesses the brutal and horrid crime. Now there is no escape. Neither Santiago Nazar nor the reader can escape their fate. The murder is gruesome, but the story is so wonderfully told. Before the curtain falls, the narrator brings to the reader's attention the fact that in this tropical tragedy there is also comedy of mirrors. Cristo Bedoya, Santiago's friend, can stop the crime but does not. He has a gun that he does not know how to use. He cannot even tell where it is, if it is loaded or not. And those who want to come forward to prevent the killing of Santiago are uncertain and put off by his apparent carefree attitude. When Santiago is told of the vicarious plan to kill him, he decides to go home. However, rather than using the back door to his home, which always is left unlocked, he decides to use the front door which faces the plaza. His mother, thinking that he is inside the house, locks the front door seconds before Santiago gets to it. The attack begins and nobody does anything to stop it. Indeed, Santiago's screams go unheard as they are confused with the sounds of Bishop's festival. So this is basically the narrative, and what is important is that here Markage is playing on the ploy of narrative. This is the brilliance and beauty of the narrative, how it is being designed, how the murder mystery is being told, constructed and reconstructed through the course of the narrative. So if we think about, if we're going to discuss about the concept of narrativity, the narrative design, how it is being designed and redesigned, how it is being constructed, questioned, parodied in the course of the narrative. There are some postmodernist elements, and how the ethos of the contemporary culture has been captured and also questioned in the narrative. If we think of William Butler Yeats's famous lines in The Second Coming, that things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed up in the world, then we see that this is there are the moments, there are the times when the Western civilization had just moved out of the shadows of the First World War, and effect of the devastation on a global scale made the modern man realize the fallacy of searching for an absolute, an ideal, a center, absolute truth, a totalizing tendency. And out of this mass disillusionment was born a culture, a mindset, a kind of fashioning of selves. People used to revel in the fragmentary, vague sensations and mere simulations of the reality they're living on. And it led to the genesis of a type of human capital who would rather identify themselves as products of a culture which was characterized by superabundance of disconnected images and styles. And as reflected in literature, the period between 1960s to 1980s and 90s evolved in the later half of the 20th century, a construction of a discourse that rejected these totalizing narratives, and instead they believed in partial, fragmented, and incomplete narratives. And we'll see how Garcia Marquez, through this narrative, the novel Chronicle of a Death Foretold, is both capturing and unsettling these tendencies of narrativizing. So the novel is, in a way, inspired from Marquez's own life, happening an event in his own life, a past incident of a gruesome killing of his own friend took place in Sucre, Colombia in 1951 in the name of honor, and was turned into a complex and rich plot of this particular novella. And this narrative is actually an attempt to piece together the fatal day when a young man was murdered for having seduced and deflowered a young woman, Angela Vicario, who was returned to her family by her outraged husband. And when, in the vein of popular literary genre of postmodernist detective fiction, if I say so, Chronicles of a Dead Foretold basically helps in reinstating what might be called the continuous presence of the past. And we see in Marquez's narrator, who is a journalist and who comes back to his hometown in order to reconstruct the events that led to the heinous butchering of his friend Santiago Nazar. So there is constantly a haunting of the past and present, the concept of the present that I discussed the other day, the presence of the present, presentness of the moment, is continuously being unsettled, disrupted, and ruptured by the evocation of a past, by the reconstruction, a kind of desire to reconstruct the past. And the narrative and the narrator himself is trying to reconstruct by collecting the information from different peoples. And this incident actually occurred 27 years back. That is very interesting. And Marquez's narrator is not an omniscient narrator, all-knowing narrator. On the contrary, he is absolutely indecisive, subjective, and hesitant narrator who finds it difficult to analyze the past incidents from an objective point of view, simply because the so-called recollection of facts pertaining to this murder get tinged with personal knowledge that the narrator has received from all the parties who are involved in the event, in the happening that happened 27 years back. And the narrator, who is also a friend of Santiago Nazar, the protagonist of the narrative that we have just discussed, a critical summary of the novel, and is searching for some answers several years after the incident, is made to act as a journalist, as a historian, as a detective, and also as a judge. So the narrative is very much is including all these materials and all these perspectives, all these points of views. Therefore, this narrative designing is so much intricate. So much confusion and doubts are inserted into this structure and act of narrativizing. And this critical revisiting of the past incident then makes the narrator and thereby the reader question the validity of the accounts of the eyewitnesses after such a long time. Such a long time has elapsed. And more importantly, and most significantly, it questions the notion of history and journalism as being a narrative that is true and absolute recounting of the past. So it is continuously interrogating and questioning the construct or the concept of history and journalism, which is presenting or proposing or putting forward putting forward the information as truthful, absolute, and recounting of the past. And it is interrogating and questioning this concept of history, this concept of information giving kind of journalism. And this probing of the past is a reflection of probing of all other constructs that are supposed to provide us with certain absolute truths. So the idea of any kind of totalizing tendency, any kind of absolutism, absolute truth or truths are continuously being questioned and unsettled, parodied, interrogated in the course of the narrative. And here all these constructs that has this kind of monolithic or totalizing tendency to create some kind of a neat, uh, closely neat, a very fixed, frozen, and formulaic structure of things, that tendency is being ruptured, questioned, and parodied in the course of the narrative. That is the beauty and brilliance of Marquez's narrativizing, and this suspicion of the absolute that could never be challenged. Uh, mm, uh, is questioned and is designed, uh, in the sense of the term that knowledge is a kind of commodity, a construction, and whose acquisition actually leads to power. And and the knowledge that generated a sense of identity and sense of self, and therefore it is a kind of body of knowledge, generates a sort of meta narrative, closely knit narratives that governed our social and cultural conduct. But this knowledge is never ever an objective apolitical. It is created and disseminated, disseminate dominant ideologies. So here in Marquez's narrative, or act of narrativizing, these tendencies, these totalizing tendencies, are constantly being questioned, parodied, and unsettled. So there is a shift, a definite shift from meta narratives, which were totalizing and homogenizing in nature, to narratives that are small, local, small scale, local, and heterogeneous. So this is happening in the course of the narration, and there is a fragmentation of the narrative, wherein multiple perspectives of all the townsfolk are provided, as no single perspective can be considered real and complete. A constant sense of incompleteness and also an incomprehensiveness is there in the in a construction of the narrative structure, in the narrative discourse. The meaning derived by the reader can never become the meaning. So the meaning making apparatuses are so fragmented that it's a kind of disorient or dislodge the construction or formation of a kind of meta narrative or mega narrative, and a closely knit structure of narrative that is being questioned, and that you find in every page of the narrative. And because the narrator is a journalist, is a historian, is a judge, and is also a character, and he is sometimes subjective, indecisive, and narratives are collection of fragmented events and informations from eyewitnesses. The real, the unreal, the fantastic, the credible, the facts, the fiction, all such boundaries gets blurred, and the result is a work of kind of magical realism, marvelous realism, low, real or marvelous, fabulation, pastiche, and even parody. These elements are there. So continuous interspersing between the real events that are happening there and which are in detail description of the realities, intimate, very intimate matter of factness is there, but constantly this matter of factness is haunted or disrupted by the intrusion of imagination, fancy, fabulation, and these close-knit boundaries between facts and fiction, credible and the fantastic, gets blurred in the course of the narrative. And Chronicle of a Death, Foretold, actually contains multiple narratives, an amalgamation of facts, feelings, imaginations, and memories of all the characters whom the narrator investigates in order to arrive at the crux of the death of Santiago Nazar, the protagonist. So memory is a very important motif in the several surreal and fantastic descriptions about the day and weather. And what is interesting is that in the beginning of the narrative, we have a clear picture that Santiago Nazar is going to be killed, and it is the very morning the the most agreed that the weather was funereal, with a cloudy low sky and the thick smell of still waters. And there's a clear depiction of when and where and how Santiago Nazar is to be murdered, killed by the Piquerio brothers, Pablo and Pedro Piquerio. But this thing is continuously being disrupted. This description or narrativizing of the event is disrupted through the intrusion of fantastic elements and multiple misinformations or informations that is gathered by the narrator himself. And here, the the act of narrativizing, the narratology is happening or is being performed from different levels. Or if we think of Gerard Genet's book, Narrative Discourse, an essay on method, discourse, de récit, which is there in the figures in the most important book by Genet. He actually provides a very rigorous and cogent model for the analysis of the time and point of view in narrative structures, and draws his examples mostly from Marcel Proust's Remembrance of Things Past. And there is a section titled Perspectives, and Genet states that talks about points of views and the confusion between the question who is the character whose point of view orients the narrative structure, narrative perspective. Sorry, narrative perspective. And the very different question, who is the narrator, and more simply, the question who sees and the question who speaks. And after reviewing a number of classification, Genet proposes that in his own system is substituting the word focalization for point of view. And there are multiple focalization in different sorts of narratives. The divides are classified into three kinds of focalization. One is called non-focalized narrative or zero focalization, and another is called internal focalization, and other is called, finally, the third one, external focalization. In the first type, that is the non-focalized narrative or zero focalization, it involves an omniscient narrator, the narrator who knows more than the characters, or knows exactly or more exactly says than any of the character knows. Omniscient narrator is all present, all knowing, everything is happening in front of him. So he is omniscient narrator. This is non-focalized narrative. And in the second term, that is internal focalization, the narrator says only what a given character knows. That is very interesting. And finally, the external focalization, that is the third term, the narrator says less than the character knows. And here in Marquez's novel, these three kinds of narrators are interspersing together, are being included. Here is also the non-focalized narrative or zero focalization. Narrator sometimes is acting as an omniscient narrator, but somewhat indecisive, subjective, and collecting fragmented informations. And he knows the characters. And again, there is also the intrusion of the idea of internal focalization, that the narrator says only what the given character knows, only giving the information that he has collected. He has drawn from the characters who were involved in the act of murder. In fact, the whole town is involved. And there is the question of justice that I have discussed the other day, the question of judgment and justice that never arrives in the course of the narrative. And finally, the third term, that is the internal, that is the external focalization, that narrator says less than the character knows. So these kinds of narrativizing are included together and being continuously being inserted and interspersed into the act of narration. And if we go back to the first opening sentences, that is the beginning of the novel, that the funeral description of the day on which Santiago Nazar was killed, and at the end of the chapter that we have discussed, Santiago Nazar is ritualistically killed, and the novel ends with Santiago Nazar falling on his face in the kitchen, and which actually, ironically, is the source of sustenance. And the narrator goes back to a crime that happened 27 years back. And this is again in connection with the real event that happened in the coastal town of Sucre in Colombia on January 22, 1951, when Centeno Gentile Cimento, 20-year-old medical student at Zavarina University of Bagada, was murdered by Victor and Joaquin Chica Salas, and their sisters Margarita was returned by his newlywed husband Miguel Reyes Valencia. And that is the source of the narrative event. And the incident has such an impact on Marquez that he decided to tell the story, that the narrative of violence in Latin America to the world. But when he goes to interview the characters in the town, he figures out that people had a confused memory of the incident that happened 27 years back, 27 years ago. That is very interesting. So everybody is memorizing the event, and that act of memorizing has its own limitations. And he carries on this kind of interviewing. The narrative provides details of 37 interviewees throughout who thought about the violent incident that happened amidst a kind of public exhibition. With the confused memory of the people, here the narrator was in a way able to construct a narrative how Santiago Nazar is a sacrificial, almost a kind of sacrificial victim of the entire community who participated in the murder by being a silent spectator to it. And that is in the narrative that I just read out that portion. Everything that happened after that is in public domain. The people who were coming back from the docks, altered by the shouts, began to take positions on the square to witness the crime. So it is happening on the public domain. The whole community, the townsfolk, is participating, taking part in the murder. And the narrator is collecting information from the townsfolk. 37 interviews are there, and all of them are memorizing the event that happened 27 years back. So the journalistic tone and the construction of a historical past, construction of the past, or reconstruction of the past, reconstitution of the past, that is happening and interspersing with the act of narration. And it is true that the novel tries to unearth the reasons of inertia of the people of the town, and the narrative can be read as a perfect model of a hermeneutic tale. It is kind of interpreting a questioning structure rather than an answer providing construct. Continuously, the narrator is continuously putting forward multiple questions because he is in confusion, he is in doubt, his indecisiveness is present in the act of narration. And unlike typical European novel, the novelist does not insist on having an willing suspension of disbelief, that kind of thing, to use the Coleridgean phrase, in what he narrates, but moreover, ask the reader to question everything that the narrator had to say in the novel. And narrator says about Santiago's murder, my personal impression is that he died without understanding his date. That is very important sentence. That is very important moment. My personal impression is that he died without understanding of his date. And does it matter whether Santiago knew the reasons of his date? Does it matter whether Santiago Nazar was really the perpetrator of Angela Vicario? as the concern of Markage seems to be not about who is the culprit was. Moreover, the emphasis is on why the whole town was suffering from a kind of inertia, the notion of unaccord. Therefore, the novel involves all the people of the town who are silent witness to the killing of Santiago Nazar by Vicario brothers, though they are too unwilling to kill him and does every possible thing to be stopped from stabbing Santiago. The violence which happened in the public domain is only a manifestation of the violence which is there in the, uh, we can say, in the collective consciousness of the people of the town. Therefore, even the lawyer stood by the thesis of homicide in legitimate defense of honor, which was upheld by the court of good faith. The twins declared at the end of the trial that they would have done it again and again, 1,000 times over for the same reason, and killing justified in the name of honor code. Violence to counter the violence perpetrated on women, where virginity is a prerequisite for marriage for women, is being critiqued by the narrator and Markage himself by revealing in such a way that the readers become conscious of the ways in which this violent consciousness is marring the lives of the community. And Markage deliberately tantalizes the readers with various people's impression of Santiago in order to maintain a curiosity and confusion of his readers. So description of Santiago Nazar is not a kind of unitary, unified description. On the one hand, we have the narrator saying that by his nature, Santiago Nazar was merry and peaceful and open-hearted. That is there in the page 6. And on the other hand, we have Victoria Guzman, that maid, Santiago's servant, who reveals about him that he is just like his father, that I have discussed the other day, a shit. And further still, we have the narrator's sister, Margot, who observes, I suddenly realized that there couldn't have been a better catch than he. And then what is left to reason is, why should a man like Santiago, who in such a catch that can marry any woman in the village, force himself on a girl like Angela Vicario, as was implied by the letter? So there is a kind of collection of confusion and doubt that is being inserted and infused into the course of the narrative. And if we take into account Sartre's that comment in what is literature, whatever the committed writer or artist, the role of committed writer, it can be easily assumed that Markage is actually trying to justify the role of the writer in revealing the violent codes by which Latin Americans are living their life. And in revealing the code and showing the way Angela Vicario becomes the mistress of her own free will, that is there in the page 58 at the end of the novel, and by making Beardus and Roman come back to her, probably persuaded by 2,000 love letters that Angela writes to him, though they remain unopened in the course of the narrative. Markage is actually making a critique of the honor code for which Santiago Nazar had to become sacrificial victim of the figure of a kind of crucified Christ who purges the town of the evil by his blood. That is there in the Markage's interview. And Markage, however, Markage has a large kind of project in mind while writing his novels, while writing this narrative, not merely to talk about the killing of Santiago Nazar, but to talk about the solitude of Latin Americans, that the Latin Americans suffer from because of the European empirical rational yardstick that is used to judge Latin American reality. And that is we find, or we have found in Markage's novel speech, the interpretation of our reality through patterns not our own serves only to make us ever more unknown, ever less free, ever more solitary. This kind of idea of solitude is crafted, and it is in a way encrypted or infused or interfused in the course of the narrative. And the ironical word, the chronicle, in the title of the novel narrative is also worth pondering over, as it is a narrative which defies the notion of a chronicle. And the author deliberately uses the word chronicle to point out how chronicle is a kind of impossibility and moving toward impossibility every time we have the correct information, and that is being destabilized, disrupted, and dislodged in the course of the narration. We have the perfect time, we have the perfect date when Santiago Nazar is being killed and murdered, and in the later half of the narrative, it is being dislodged, it is being unsettled with multiple information that defy that idea of the perfectness of time. So a kind of movement toward an impossibility. Chronicle is a movement toward an impossibility, and it is of concern here that history and representation of history itself from the scientific, rational, factual means has been the valid means of understanding life, culture, and civilization due to the Eurocentric way of looking at the world, which Marquez is actually critiquing, and critiquing from the perspective of a kind of Latin American reality. And he is probably taking into account the death of Santiago Nazar to probe deeper into the violence of restricting representations to a monolithic scheme. So, and finally, if we come back to the course of the narrative, what is happening there, just to repeating the course of the narrative and the act of narrativizing, how it is being constructed, and the reconstitution of the past is being happening in the course of the narrative, and how it is being unsettled. If we come back to the narrative, and that it is again a kind of distortion of the validity of reality created by each and every character, and Marquez is clearly is weaving these literary techniques into his novel, and unnamed narrator recounts the events within the story through a first person point of view, that I discussed a little while ago, creating crucial obstacles of uncovering the truths in his tale. And he is placing his narrator at the center of the story, and he experiences everything the townspeople experienced during the sequence of events that led to the murder of Santiago Nazar 27 years back, prior to his attempt to retell the story. So retelling of the story is very important, and retelling is again connected to the question of reconstitution of the past, and it is again linked with the question of memory, the act of memorizing. An act of memorizing an event that happened 27 years back involves a kind of confusion and doubt. So the narrator, who is a potential narrator who can defy these constructions, who actually is constructing and creating this kind of this fixed or formulaic form of narrative, and it is being unsettled in the course of the narration. That is happening in the course of the narration. That is happening or in connection with this. And perplexed by his own uncertainty, the narrator returns to the site of known where the murder occurred in an attempt to place everything together piece by piece, and to sustain the element of ambiguity. And the Marquez's narrator has his chronicler, Marquez's narrator, who has only thinly developed each of his fellow villagers. There is also the development of the fellow actors in the course of the narrative, and in effect, the bare minimum description leaves the legitimacy of the testimonies up to the reader's own opinion. So the position of the reader is very important. He is also being inserted into the course of the narrative. He has to gather and collect the information that the narrator is proposing and putting forward, and he has to himself has to create, reconstitute, or reconstruct that event in his own way, his or her own way. And an example of this kind of ambiguity is there that appears in the character of Clotilde Armenta, owner of the milk shop and a certain central informant of the events that transpired. Her intention proved to be hard to unveil, because it allowed the Vicario brothers, that the murderer of Nazar, stay in front of her own store, knowing her plan to kill Nazar. However, she knew them so well that she could tell them apart, and would have shown that they were not to be taken seriously. That is the beauty and brilliance of the narrative, that willing suspension of belief. Here one finds how the first person point of view limits the possibility of discerning the truth. The narrator can only tap into the information people are willing to tell him. In actuality, he can only be certain of what he sees and hears firsthand, and in the end, it is unclear. It remains absolutely unclear which character can be trusted. That is very important thing. And with this in mind, the validity of Angela's declaration of her stolen virginity should be carefully considered, carefully read. The reader must decide if Angela's statement, he was the one, or that is there in the page 90, or the general sentiment that no one would have thought, nor did anyone think, that Angela Vickery was not a virgin, is true. There is an equal amount of evidence or lack thereof to support each case, each of the cases. Without the ability to actually see Angela's thoughts, the truth remains yet again uncertain. So there is no verification. This veracity is constantly being questioned and unsettled in the course of the narrative, in the act of narrativizing. And using this point of view, the author actually presents and supports his belief that the truth is invariably impossible to know. Then that is a kind of epistemological position, or we can say it ontological, a position of the being, or this idea of knowing fully, a fully finished kind of knowing is false in the passage of impossibility. Within the passage of impossibility, it is impossible to know. And having his narrator approaching the events through the perspective of a reporter, Marquez actually allows for a creation of a narrative voice, and like that of reporters in the reporter. In the real world, the narrator's main purpose is to uncover the truth of the incident, and Marquez endows his narrator with the ability to stay as detached and objective as humanly possible. However, this proves to be difficult, as his human tendency to have preconceived notion of certain things leads the narrator himself to become a questionable source of information. That is the very important thing. That narrator himself is a questionable source of information. His personal opinion of Nazar as being a merry and peaceful and open-hearted man clashes with that of the cook, Victoria Guzman, who often witnessed his disgusting attitude towards women and macho manner. And the author ensures that his reporter does not question or verify the veracity of the information he collects, leaving his readers with their own opinions to sort out the truths. And the 27-year time lapse must also be considered as the distorted puzzle of the murder comes together. So continuous, the idea of presence of the past. So unearthing the mystery, uncovering the truth, which the incident that happened 27 years back, the time lapse is very important. And many of the memories have surely become vague, leaving space for alterations as each character sees fit. And for instance, the Vicario brothers remember it was not raining, just the opposite. Meanwhile, the Colonel Aponte remarks that it had begun to rain at 5 o'clock. And these seemingly minute details all assist in the ambiguity and confusion that accumulates with each person's account. So continuous accumulation and consolidation of this ambiguity, confusion, and doubt. And there is similarly an amount of guilt that each person feels warps on the truth in his or her account. And when Colin Aponte adds his recollection to the countless others, he says no one is arrested on suspicion, justifying why he had allowed the Vicario brothers to remain outside Clotilde's store before the murder. At any rate, the reporters attempt to simply bring up or regurgitate the fact that is given proves to be unsuccessful in that the story itself remains as confused as ever. And Marquez enlists mm, uh, 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 mm, Markage is also in creating these kinds of confusion. Markage is actually depicting the Latin American scenario, Latin American culture, Latin American the political moment, and uh, the the reporter, the narrator, compiles the stories. A distinction can be made between perspectives of those who had been informed of the murder and share in the collective sentiment of guilt, and those who earnestly tried to put a stop to the crime. And without any formal confirmation, it can be assumed that the townspeople who knowingly allowed the murder to take place had their own incentives for it. They're being involved. They're getting involved. And Father Amador claims that he simply forgot to warn Nazar. The explanation, however, is insufficient due to the fact that after performing a massacre of an autopsy, the priest took Nazar's guts and gave them an angry blessing and threw them into the garbage. And Nazar was known to be an Arab as his father, Ibrahim Nazar, and a wealthy one. And in doing what he did to Nazar's intestines, the priest exemplifies the collective jealousy and animosity towards Santiago, towards the Arab nationals. And there is the race question and class question intrudes into the course of the narrative. That is very important. There are we can see if we read the narrative carefully that we have judgmental portions on the Arab nationals, on the mulatto girls, mulatto maids, and the question of race comes into being, and this force of ambiguity remains there. And of those who were aware of the murder, the one whose actions on the day proved to be the most ambiguous are that of the victim himself, that is, Nazar himself. Nazar cringes at the morning ritual of gutting the rabbits, commanding his cook to make believe it was a human being appearing to sense something on that morning. So, a kind of sense of meanness. Yet the narrator himself remarks, nor it was known that what card Santiago Nazar was playing, suggesting the possibility of Nazar knowing of his approaching death. Because the narrator offers no information into the perspective of Nazar himself, his conviction is projected to the perception of others. And there is no doubt that the guilt felt throughout the town, shakes it forever, often causing people to mask the truth of events. And accordingly, those who feel the guilt in relation to the murder, perceive Nazar as knowing that it would take place. And again, the reader is placed in the position to decide what is truth and what is made up. The author's use of perceptions proves to aid the uncertainty felt through the entirety of the course of the narrative. And questions of deciphering the truth in Marquez's novel will never stop being asked. It is for this reason that the writer has won such high acclaim, and he achieves his initial intention of using point of view or perspective as means by which to create uncertainty. And although there had never been a date more foretold, that is a declaration, and it could be argued that the statement would better read, and there has never been a date more confused. Thank you.
Thank you, Anirban. It's a great lecture. It's been a great lecture. I would just like to summarize a bit what Anirban has given us this evening. How Garcia Marquez punked the totalizing narrative. How there is a shift from meta narratives. How the presentness of the moment is continuously disrupted by constant recollection of events that happened 27 years back, and how the truth is being constantly questioned with journalistic investigations. Now, I particularly liked the place where Anirban said that Garcia Marquez's narrative is not a questioning structure, rather it's an answer. Narrative is a questioning structure and not an answer providing machine. Now, I have a few unrelated questions. Actually, when I read Chronicle of a Death Foretold, I always found that there was a brief from the investigating magistrate, which was around 500 pages long,
Yes.
and only around 300 or 350 pages came to the narrator's hands. Now, there are certain references in the text where Marquez says that the square door was referred to as the fatal door. The magistrate must have been reading Nietzsche or Spanish classics. He must have been a very well-read person. So, what I sensed at that point of time, that there is a difference between literature and journalistic investigation, as if what he's writing is more important and much different, not more important precisely, but much different from literature.
Act of writing is very important. The act of narration or act of writing is very important. Therefore, this literary reference is coming again and again in the course of the narrative. And the
Yeah.
magistrate, who is unbelievably an avid reader of Nietzsche and other texts, and these references are coming in. So it can be stated that the Chronicle of a Dead Folk is a sort of is not only the magistrate is not only investigating what happened 27 years back, or through that book, that thing, or uh, to come back into it reality. Rather, he is gathering this kind of opinions and information from different sources, and the mm, idea of a text uh, is being in the process. That is the thing. A kind of meta reading is happening there.
Yes, I also found some a very important. I
And
found it important at
Bhattacharjee
that
is very
point.
conscious about this, very consciously
Yes,
doing this.
yes. There is also a point where during the reading of the brief, Marquez says that uh, literature doesn't allow so much coincidences. So the entire text is filled with coincidences. So would you like to
Yeah.
say something on how the narrative treats coincidences in the text?
It is there in multiple times because these chances and coincidences are coming in and coming back again and again in the course of the narrative. And if you think of Santiago Nazar's murder, and that is that narrative, that portion of the narrative is coming again and again in the first chapter, in the third chapter, at the end of the first chapter, and in the final chapter. And there is a detailed description of the narrative and how these knives are being used. And there is also the race question that I have discussed just a little bit there, that the Arab nationals are being they are being treated by the priests and the fathers, and and the idea of coincidences or chances there are there because Santiago Nazar's date is being foretold. It is written. It is going to happen. It is a kind of absolute kind of thing, and there is what I have discussed, that the totalizing kind of tendency to read out the date that have been foretold or designed or constructed, but the coincidences are coming back and coming again and again to unsettle this movement, this fixed, frozen, or formulaic kind of structure that is written there. And Santiago Nazar was not aware of these things that happened in the course of the narrative.
If there are
No,
any
no,
more
no.
questions in the YouTube section, or any of the other faculty members wish to ask any question.
I have a comment to make. Am I audible? Yeah. Uh,
Yes, yes.
I was wondering that one very important question which is coming up in your lecture, and it's a very important question in general, that is the question of community and the question of truth versus community. That is, if truth is universal or truth depends on which community you belong to. Western epistemology has actually addressed, liberal epistemology has addressed the truth question in a particular way through the legal judiciary, this entire legal apparatus. But we have seen repeatedly from within the Western discourse, like you have Kafka and others, and also from outside, repeatedly the question comes, particularly it becomes crucial when it comes to the question of other communities. For example, as an Indian, we also face these questions that whether the judgmental paradigm, the parameters which we use in the West, they can be translated very easily to our Indian situation, or whether we should reverse it. Like that is also problematic. If I say that in India honor killing is justified, in Latin America honor killing is good, that is also problematic. So I know that there is no easy answer, but how to negotiate between these two counterparts? These are two very difficult counterparts. On one hand, you have the legal system, you have the system of justice, which you have to maintain, which you have to deliver justice, because we live in the modern democracy. On the other hand, you repeatedly have to go back to the question of the individual particular community. So that is basically my curiosity.
সম্রাট দা বাংলায় বলবো, কারণ এটা খুব মানে একটু ক্রিটিক্যাল প্রশ্নটা।
বাংলায় বলো, আমি কি বাংলায় বলে, আমি কি এক লাইনে বাংলায় বলে দেবো?
একটু বলো, বাংলায় বললে খুব ভালো হয়, কারণ তুমি তো নানান ধরনের টেকনিক্যাল শব্দ ব্যবহার করছো, একটুখানি বুঝিয়ে বললে ভালো হয়।
আচ্ছা, যারা শুনছে বা যারা শুনছে না, যাই হোক, ছাত্রদের জন্য বলে দিচ্ছি সহজ করে। সেটা হচ্ছে যে এই যে সত্যের যে ধারণা, এই যে একটা লোককে হত্যা করা হয়েছে, হ্যাঁ, এবং হত্যা করার কারণ হচ্ছে যে সে আরেকজন মহিলার সাথে শারীরিক সম্পর্ক করে তাকে বিয়ের আগেই প্রেগনেন্ট করে দিয়েছিল। তাই তার বাড়ির লোকেরা, সেই মেয়েটি যখন রিফিউজড হয় তখন তার বাড়ির লোকেরা তাকে মেরে ফেলতে আসছে, এবং তার মধ্যে দিয়ে এই যে আইনের প্রশ্ন, ন্যায় নীতির প্রশ্নটা চলে আসছে। তো আমাদের ওয়েস্টার্ন ইয়েতে এক ধরনের যে খুন করলে তোমার শাস্তি হবে, তুমি একটা মানুষের স্বাধীনতাকে বিঘ্নিত করতে পারো না। এই যে স্বাধীনতা, অপরাধ, এই জিনিসগুলোকে তো আমরা আগে থেকে ডিফাইন করে রেখেছি, কিন্তু অনেক সময় হয় যে কি, আমি একজন ইন্ডিয়ান, আমি হিন্দু বা আমি মুসলিম, বা আমি হয়তো কোনো একটা পার্টিকুলার জায়গার অঞ্চলের মানুষ, আমি বললাম যে আমাদের দেশে এরকম, আমাদের দেশে বা আমার কমিউনিটিতে, আমি যে ধর্মের মানুষ বা যে জায়গার মানুষ, সেখানে এরকমই জাস্টিস, যে তুমি একটা মেয়ের সাথে এরকম করলে তাকে মেরেই ফেলা হবে, হ্যাঁ, এতে কোনো অন্যায় নেই। তো আমার কথা হচ্ছে যে এই কমিউনিটি প্রশ্নটা খুব ইম্পর্টেন্ট। আমরা তো একটা ডেমোক্রেসিতে বাস করি, গণতন্ত্রে বাস করি, তাহলে গণতন্ত্রের প্রশ্নটাও আমাকে অ্যাড্রেস করতে হবে। আমাকে এই প্রশ্নটাও অ্যাড্রেস করতে হবে যে যে একটা কমিউনিটি সেটা আলাদা হতে পারে, তার নিজস্ব ভ্যালু সিস্টেম থাকতে পারে, তার ভ্যালু সিস্টেমে কোনটা অপরাধ নয়, সেটাও আমাকে দেখতে হবে। দুটোকে আমি কি করে ম্যাচ করব, এইটা আমার কাছে একটা প্রশ্ন। এবং সাহিত্য আমাদের এই ডিফিকাল্ট প্রশ্নগুলোর সামনে দাঁড় করায়। হ্যাঁ, তো এইটা একটু জিজ্ঞেস করছি।
এটা খুবই গুরুত্বপূর্ণ একটা প্রশ্ন, কারণ এটা কিন্তু আসলে এই রিডিং এর মধ্যে দিয়ে, পাঠের মধ্যে দিয়েই তৈরি হতে পারে। মানে আমরা যখন ক্রনিকল পড়ছি, তখন আমাদের মনে হচ্ছে যে পাশ্চাত্য ভাবনায় বা পাশ্চাত্য দর্শন, পাশ্চাত্য জ্ঞান চর্চায় যে সত্যকে যেভাবে দেখা হয়, এবং সত্যকে দেখতে গিয়ে যে ক্যাটেগরি গুলো ব্যবহার করা হয়, তুমি যদি জাস্টিসের ভাবনা ধরো, লিগালিটির ভাবনা ধরো, যে সমস্ত ডিসকোর্স গুলো এর সাথে সাথে লেগে থাকে বা আষ্টে পৃষ্ঠে মানে জোট বেঁধে থাকে, সেটাকে কিন্তু পাশ্চাত্য ভাবনায়, পাশ্চাত্যের একটা ঘরানার মধ্যে দিয়ে সেটাকে প্রশ্ন করা হচ্ছে। সেই প্রশ্ন করার মানে সেটাকে ধরে থাকে যে মানে লেগে থাকছে, এইটাকে যে ভাবা এবং তাকে যে প্রশ্ন করা, তার একটা নির্দিষ্ট ঘরানা আছে। কিন্তু এই ল্যাটিন আমেরিকান ফিকশনের ক্ষেত্রে সেই ঘরানাটা পাল্টে যাচ্ছে। এখানে যেটা ঘটছে, মানে এখানেও প্রশ্নটা করা হচ্ছে, কিন্তু প্রশ্ন করার যে তরিকা এবং প্রশ্নটা যে ঘটছে, তার যে হ্যাপেনিং, এই জিনিসটা কিন্তু ঠিক অন্যরকম ভাবে হচ্ছে। এটা খুব মজার। ওইখানে প্রশ্ন করার বা বলার যে তরিকা, তার যে টেকনিক, তার স্ট্রাকচার, তার যে অ্যাক্ট অফ ন্যারেটিভাইজিং একরকম, আর এখানে অন্যরকম হচ্ছে। তার কারণ হচ্ছে এখানে কমিউনিটির যে ভাবনাটাও কিন্তু এখানে একটুখানি স্পেসিফিক হয়ে উঠছে, যেটা কিনা মার্কেট বিভিন্ন ইন্টারভিউ এর মধ্যে দিয়ে বলছে যে এই কমিউনিটিকে আমরা বুঝতে হবে কিন্তু সলিটিউড এবং সাইলেন্সের মধ্যে দিয়ে, কারণ এরা কথা বলতে পারে না। এমন একটা জিনিস যেটা মানে স্টেটেড, তার ভেতরে কি ঘটছে সেটাকে আনকাভার করাই কিন্তু মার্কেজের এই জায়গাটা। মানে এখানে কিন্তু মডার্নিটির সাথে ক্লাসটা ঠিক অন্যরকম। এখানে কিন্তু সত্যের ধারণাটা, যেটা কিনা আমরা ওয়েস্টার্ন এপিস্টেমোলজিক্যাল, ওয়েস্টার্ন ডিসকোর্সে মানে পাশ্চাত্য ভাবনায় দেখি যে ট্রুথ ইজ দ্য থিং অফ দ্য ওয়ার্ল্ড, যেটা কিনা ফুকোর মধ্যে আসছে বা নিটশের মধ্যে আসছে। সত্যের একটা মেটেরিয়ালিটি আছে, সত্যের একটা জীবন আছে, সত্য একটা বস্তু, মানে সত্যটা উৎপাদিত হচ্ছে। এখানে যেখানে এখানে একটা সত্যটাকে ধরে নিয়ে তার ভেতরকার কনফিউশন গুলোকে কিন্তু বের করা হচ্ছে, এবং এখানে দেখা যাচ্ছে যে পুরো কমিউনিটি কিন্তু কনফিউজড, ডাউটের মধ্যে আছে। কেউ কিন্তু আসলে মানে সত্যটা যে কি সেইটা ধরতে পারছে না বা বুঝছে না বা বুঝতে চাইছে না, এবং সেই কনফিউশনটা নিয়েই বেঁচে থাকছে। তাই জন্য এক একজনের যে ইনফরমেশন, যে পিস অফ ইনফরমেশন দ্য ন্যারেটর ইজ ড্রয়িং আউট ফ্রম ডিফারেন্ট ইন্টারভিউস, সেটা কিন্তু মানে প্রথম থেকে শেষ পর্যন্ত একটা আনসার্টেনিটি, অ্যাম্বিগুইটি, ডাউট, কনফিউশনের মধ্যে দিয়ে যাচ্ছে। কোনো সময় এই কনফিউশনটাকে তার ক্লারিফিকেশন হচ্ছে না, এবং শেষ পর্যন্ত মানে এখানে ওই সত্যটার মধ্যে কনফিউশনটা ইনবিল্ট, ইনগ্রেইনড, এবং সেখানে কমিউনিটির ভাবনাটাও ঢুকে রয়েছে। মানে এটা কোনো একটা পার্টিকুলার সিঙ্গুলার সার্চ নয়, এটা হচ্ছে একটা কমিউনিটির সার্চ, কিন্তু একই সঙ্গে পার্টিকুলার এবং সিঙ্গুলার। তার কারণ হচ্ছে সত্য এবং তার যে অবক্ষয়, তার যে অপচয় বা তার যে অতিক্ষয় বলা যেতে পারে, ক্যাটাক্রিচিস, যেটা কিনা আমরা পোস্ট স্ট্রাকচারালিজম বা পোস্ট মডার্নিজমে আমরা ব্যবহার করি, বা স্পিভাকের লেখার মধ্যে আছে যেটা বলছেন অতিক্ষয়, মানে কেটে কেটে ছেটে ছেটে, মানে ক্ষয়িষ্ণু যে ভাবনাটা, সেটা কিন্তু এই লাতিন আমেরিকান ফিকশনের মধ্যে ইনবিল্ট, ইনগ্রেইনড, এবং এটা একটা অর্গানিক জিনিস, এবং সেটাই বারে বারে রিফ্লেক্টেড হচ্ছে সাইলেন্স এবং সলিটিউডের মধ্যে, এবং সেটা পুরো ন্যারেটিভটা জুড়ে রয়ে গেছে। এটার মধ্যে কোনো কিন্তু সত্য এবং অসত্য বা অনিশ্চয়তার মধ্যে ফাঁক ফোকর পাওয়া যাচ্ছে না। মানে অনিশ্চয়তাকেই সত্য বলে ধরে নিয়ে একটা মানে স্টেটেড একটা ইয়ে রয়েছে, মানে সেটা রিফ্লেক্টেড হচ্ছে। মানে এটা কি মানে ধরা যায়? এটা এইভাবে কি বলা যেতে পারে? মানে আমারও এটা একটা প্রশ্ন, যে অনিশ্চয়তাকেই সত্য বা এটাই হচ্ছে স্টেটেড জিনিস, এটাই রিফ্লেক্টেড, এটাই পার্সপেক্টিভ, এটাই রিয়ালিটি, এইভাবে দেখা। এই যে আনসার্টেনিটি গুলো এগুলো জড়ো হয়ে একটা কনসলিডেটেড হচ্ছে, এবং সেটা এমন ভাবে হচ্ছে যে আগের থেকে বলা হচ্ছে মানে নেভার বিন ফোরটোল্ড, এমন একটা জিনিস যেটা আমরা জানি কিন্তু সেটা আসলে একটা কনফিউশন। মানে আমাদের জানার যে জ্ঞান চর্চার যে টেকনিক বা স্ট্র্যাটেজিটাকেই মানে ভেঙে দিচ্ছে, প্রশ্ন করছে। আসলে আমাদের জানাটা অনিশ্চয়তাকে হয়তো জানা, অনিশ্চয়তার দিকে, ইম্পসিবিলিটির দিকে মুভমেন্টটা, মানে সত্যের দিকে আসলে না, উল্টো মানে মুখটা ঘুরিয়ে দিচ্ছে উনি। তাই জন্য এখানে আসলে ঘটনাটা ঘটেছে সেটা আমরা কেউ জানতে পারছি না। এমনি আমরা মনে হচ্ছে যে অ্যাঞ্জেলা ভিকেরিওকে ডিফ্লাওয়ার করার জন্য আসলে তাকে তাড়িয়ে দেওয়া হলো, এই হলো, কিন্তু আদৌ যে তাকে ডিফ্লাওয়ার করা হয়েছিল কিনা বা কে করেছে সে নিজেও জানে না, কখনোই সেটা ন্যারেটিভটার মধ্যে দিয়ে প্রকটই হচ্ছে না। এটা একদম
আমরা এটা ইয়ে দিয়ে দেরিতা দিয়ে যদি আমরা বলি যে জাস্টিস আছে, কিন্তু জাস্টিসটা পুরোপুরি সম্পূর্ণ হচ্ছে না, কখনো কোথাও একটা আনডিসাইডেবিলিটি থেকেই যাচ্ছে। জাস্টিস যদি সম্পূর্ণ হয়ে যায় ভাবি, তাহলে সেটাই এক ধরনের ইনজাস্টিসের জন্য। এখানে ন্যারেটিভের ক্ষেত্রে আমরা যদি সেটা ভাবি যে ন্যারেটিভটা এমন ভাবে তৈরি, ন্যারেটিভ জাস্টিস মানে কি, আমরা গল্পের শেষে অপরাধী শাস্তি পেল, অপরাধ ধরা পড়ে গেল, এটা জাস্টিস। কিন্তু সেটা যদি হয় তাহলে আরো অনেক কিছুকে বাদ দেওয়া হয়, কিন্তু সেইগুলোকে নিয়েই যেন তোমার ইয়ে থেকে মনে হচ্ছে সেগুলোকে নিয়েই চলতে চাইছে। মানে সেই কমিউনিটির ধারণা, তাদের ভেতরকার যে অব্যক্ততা, যেগুলো বলা যাচ্ছে না, যে ক্রাইসিস গুলো, যেগুলো ওই কমিউনিটির যে বিলিফ গুলো, যেগুলোকে পুরোপুরি তারা নিজেরাও বলে উঠতে পারে না এই লিগাল ডিসকোর্সের সামনে, সেগুলো সব চলে আসছে। ফলত
এটা একটা
আমরা
জিনিস যে অনিশ্চয়তার মধ্যে দিয়ে চলতে গিয়ে তাদের একটা স্বস্তি রয়েছে, মানে এটা কোনো অস্বস্তি নয়, তাদের কিন্তু অস্বস্তি নেই যে অনিশ্চয়তার জন্য, যেটা কিনা আমাদের মধ্যে হয় বা পাশ্চাত্য ঘরানার মধ্যে, যে অনিশ্চয়তার মধ্যে পড়লে একটা অস্বস্তি, একটা কোন ধরনের তুমি অনিরাপত্তা তুমি বোধ করো, তুমি নিরাপদ নও, এটা অস্বস্তিকর বিষয় অনিশ্চয়তা মানে। কিন্তু এখানে অনিশ্চয়তা কিন্তু এখানে একটা স্বস্তি দেয়। তাই জন্য প্রত্যেকেই যেন একটা এই ব্যাপারটা যে ঘটেছে অনিশ্চয় জানে, কনফিউশন তার মধ্যে রয়েছে, ডাউট হয়েছে, কিন্তু তারা যেন একদম খুব একদম ননশালেন্ট, ইনডিফারেন্ট, অলসো ইনভলভড, এটার মধ্যে পুরো কমিউনিটিটা ইনভলভ, এইটা দেখা যাচ্ছে। মানে কোথাও একটা অনিশ্চয়তার মধ্যে তার একটা স্বস্তি, এটা অদ্ভুত ব্যাপার না? মানে এই ব্যাপারটা কিন্তু একটু অন্য ধরনের, যে পুরো কমিউনিটিটা একটা নিরাপত্তার মধ্যে, একটা ওই অস্বস্তিদায়ক এর মধ্যে দিয়ে যাচ্ছে, কোথাও যেন একটা ওই জিনিসটা রয়েছে,
খুব ইন্টারেস্টিং
সেন্স অফ মানে সেফ, তাহলে যেন ওইটা রয়েছে, কিন্তু সবই হচ্ছে অনিশ্চয়।
ভালো।
Okay, if we have any further questions.
আমার মনে হয় আপাতত প্রশ্ন নেই, তবে আমি যদি মানে ছাত্রছাত্রী যদি চায় তাহলে আমি একটা মানে হ্যান্ড আউট বা দু তিনটে ইস্যু নিয়ে দিতে পারি। মেটেরিয়াল
ভালো হয়,
পাঠিয়ে দিতে
খুব
পারি
ভালো হয়।
তাদের এবং
Definitely.
এই টেক্সটকে
হ্যাঁ,
আরো নানান পড়া যেতে পারে। আর সম্রাটদা পড়াবে বা তোমরা পড়াবে, তখন আরো নানান কিছু এক্সপ্লোর করা যাবে। আমি হয়তো ২-৩টে পয়েন্ট পার্সপেক্টিভ ধরে একটু বলার চেষ্টা করি। এটাকে নানান ভাবে
হ্যাঁ,
পড়া যেতে ইচ্ছে।
Thank you, Anirban. I'll ask Pavel Moni, our head of the department, to conclude with vote of thanks. Thank you.
Good evening. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Anirban Bhattacharjee for accepting our invitation uh, to come to this online platform of our department and delivering two wonderful lectures on Marquez's novel Chronicle of Her Death Foretold. Thank you again. And I would like to thank the audience, those who have been with us for these 2 days. Uh, and I take this opportunity to thank Dr. Shantiranjan Palchaudhuri, who is our principal of our college, for giving us permission to organize this online lecture series. And last but not the least, my colleagues. I won't thank them. I just want to say that it's a privilege to have such wonderful colleagues. We are like brothers. We are not colleagues actually. So, and this is an online lecture series, and hopefully we'll be able to organize some more lectures on some more topics in our syllabus. Uh, so we'll be sharing the information with you. Um, and that's all. And uh, stay strong and united. Be safe. We'll meet again. Thank you. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you, Pavel. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.